you so much for being back to teach for us again. And just so you know, for those of you who've been in his classes before, we have 2 copies of his notes. If anybody feels like they can listen better, if they see that in front of them. So
I'm a visual learner, so yes.
okay, I'll pass it this way. And then we'll send those out to everyone tomorrow in case you're wanting to look back at anything.
And Joyce and Malcolm are on Zoom.
Well, thanks, Karen. And this is, I hope you know, is the first of a 4-part series once a week. It's called Free to Believe, from the Reformation to RFRA. And what that really means is from the Reformation to right now, because there's some RFRA issues involved in Indiana at this moment. So over these next 4 presentations, we will look at who controls what people believe and how they act on those beliefs. And we'll see that this freedom to believe as you see fit is not a matter of concern just today, but it's been a matter of debate for hundreds of years. The ability of people to believe what they want or choose was the subject of the Reformation, not quite so successfully, the First Amendment to the Constitution. And today we will start back in the Middle Ages, looking at the Imperial Catholic Church and some of the early reformers, names I'm sure most of you have not heard of before. Early reformers who tried to give people the right to believe what they want. They're called morning stars. They were unsuccessful in their day, but set in motion the ideas that eventually led to the religious freedom that we all enjoy today. As we will see, when authorities seek to control what people believe, people die. And as we also will see, even today, there are serious debates about exactly what religious freedom means. In the last presentation of this series, I will give you some questions to show how difficult that can sometimes be. So let's begin by looking first at where the debate about religious freedom really began. The next slide, please. In 1054, Bishop Humbert of Silva Candida traveled to Constantinople on behalf of Pope Leo, the Bishop of Rome, and delivered a bull of excommunication to the Patriarch of Constantinople in the Hagia Sophia. The result was what we call the Great Schism, or schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church that continues to this day. After the next. There we go. After the Great Schism, all of Western Europe except the Iberian Peninsula, which is under Islamic control, came under the jurisdiction of the Pope, considered himself the successor of Peter. And the bishop then turned himself to the most important issue of the day: who should control what people believed. Both the Pope and the secular authorities saw themselves as having the same mission, assuming that people would not burn in hell, which each thought required that they control how people believed and acted. No one at the time of individuals had the right to determine what they believed or how they acted on those beliefs. Not a single person. One author says, quote, "Since Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, Western Christian leaders have believed that thanks to Adam's bite of the apple, man was so inherently depraved, a strong 1-2 punch of the church and state working together would be required to tame his evil impulse." Both popes and secular authorities can cite the Bible to support their competing claims to who should be in charge of that mission of controlling thought. So let's get this up. So the popes refer to the time that Jesus took his disciples to Caesarea Philippi before he went to Jerusalem for the last time. While he was there, Jesus had told Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The popes, claiming to be successors of Peter's, therefore claimed the power to determine what people need to believe, and whatever they decided would be binding on God. Let's go next slide. Kings and emperors also looked to Peter for their claim to have power over the destiny of the souls of their subjects. So in the first letter to Peter, which the author assumed at the time to have been Peter, probably not, it says, quote, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to emperor as the supreme authority or the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right." So the secular authority said, well, Peter told us that we were in charge. Let's go to the next slide. So all the popes and secular rulers base their competing claims on the Bible. The issue is more about money and power than on theology. One of the sources of conflict was the ability to appoint, or what was called invest, bishops, a power that was claimed by both the popes and secular rulers. Why is this important? Well, because this power to appoint gave an ability to obtain a payment from the one appointed. The practice known as simony, after Simon offered to pay Peter and John to give them the ability to give people the power of the Holy Spirit. So the popes and the emperors, well, I should have the power to appoint bishops because that way they can pay me for this privilege. So in about 1058, Bishop Humbert wrote a paper nominally addressed to simony that was really attacked on the authority of secular leaders over all matters involving religion, including the investor bishops. He argued, quote, since church and state actually form one body, Christendom, whose animating principle is the faith, it can be directed to its final goal, eternal salvation, only by the priesthood. Therefore, whether spiritual and temporal powers come into conflict, as often they must, the spiritual authority must have the final word. Since virtually every secular question at the time was seen as having a spiritual component, Humbert's argument was a demand for revolutionary change in the very structure of medieval society, which the Pope could control the secular authorities. In 1073, Hildebrand of Sylvana became Pope Gregory VII, determined to put this idea into practice and assert papal supremacy in a thorough fashion. In 1075, Pope Gregory issued a decree that the Pope was the only universal power. Only the Pope could appoint bishops. He
In what
also
year? What year? Sorry.
1075. Also decreed that the Pope had the power to depose secular rulers who owed the Pope allegiance as Peter's successor. Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV correctly saw this decree as a threat to his control of bishops who held significant land under his domain. Henry responded by investing his own bishop of Milan and denouncing the Pope. When Gregory threatened to depose Henry if he did not revoke his appointment, Henry claimed that Gregory was at present not Pope, but false monk, and demanded that he resign. In January 1076, in an assembly at Worms, Germany, bishops loyal to Henry declared their independence from the Pope. The competing actions of Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV over the power to invest bishops became known as the Investiture controversy. In this fight, Pope Gregory wielded a weapon that no king could muster. He excommunicated Henry IV. As understood at the time, excommunication deprived Henry of the grace essential for salvation. Here's a quote. After some bishop read the solemn sentence of excommunication, a bell rang as for a funeral, a book was closed, and a candle was extinguished, all to symbolize the cutting off of the guilty man. If he entered a church during Mass, he was expelled, or the Mass was halted. Let's go next slide. But more important for Emperor Henry, excommunication also meant that his troops, no longer believing that God would protect them, would refuse to fight for him. So in January 1077, Henry capitulated. He traveled over the Alps to the Pope's retreat in Canossa in northern Italy, begging forgiveness and offering allegiance to the Pope. Wearing a hair shirt, he waited barefoot in the snow outside the castle for 3 days until Gregory finally gave him absolution and restored him to grace. Machiavelli later wrote, quote, Henry is the first prince to have the honor of feeling the sharp thrust of spiritual weapons. Over the next century, popes were to excommunicate 8 emperors. Gregory had fashioned a new power. Even the threat of excommunication could bring the most powerful princes to their knees. In 1095, 20 years after Gregory's decree that the Pope is the only universal power, Pope Urban II made a formal call for Christians to join in a war to overthrow the Muslims in the Holy Land, an idea first proposed by Gregory. The Pope promised the people their sins would be forgiven if they joined this effort. A promise that would later form the basis of the practice of the selling of indulgences. One authorized quote, by the act of proclaiming the First Crusade, which he himself, their papal legate, was to be the leader, Urban made of the papacy, in effect, the visible and actual head of the Christian people. So, in this environment, where the popes are determining that they control secular authorities, control what people believe, out of this came a French merchant named Valdez, who, quote, gave his property to the poor in 1173 and became an itinerant preacher. 400 years before Martin Luther, Valdez, known to history as Peter Waldo, thought that the Bible, and especially the New Testament, is the sole rule of belief in life. Whatever lacks one in Scripture is not justified in the church. So his followers could determine the truth themselves. He commissioned a translation of the Bible into French. Remember, this is 12th century. The first non-Latin version in Europe. His followers rejected masses and prayers for the dead as unbiblical. Valdez did not consider ordination necessary to preaching and believed that women had the right to preach, 12th century. When Valdez refused to stop preaching after being ordered to do so, he and his followers, who became known as Waldensians, were excommunicated in 1184. But Valdez, not afraid of excommunication, kept preaching. Another slide. Innocent III, by the way, all things is interesting, we call these popes innocent. Who became Pope in 1188, issued a decree officially calling for the complete subordination of the state to the church. Quote, Innocent III told the princes of Europe that the papacy was like the sun, while the kings were like the moon. As the sun received its light from the sun, so the kings derived their powers from the Pope. Go ahead. So one of those princes was King John of England, famous for agreeing to the Magna Carta, foundation of the view that the sovereign's power is limited and depends on the consent of the government. Most Americans never hear the rest of that story. In 1207, before the Magna Carta, King John had appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury in opposition to the candidate of Pope Innocent III. The Pope then imposed an interdict on the people of England, barring the priests and people from participating in most religious activities, and then excommunicated King John. Well, if all your subjects are excommunicated, you imagine what pressure that puts on the king. Under pressure of his subjects in 1213, King John, quote, capitulated to Innocent by becoming his vassal, receiving England back as a fief, and paying Innocent a sizable annual tribute. I want you to keep that in mind. England is now paying tribute to the Pope. As a result, when King John signed the Magna Carta with his barons in 1215, Pope Innocent annulled it as being beyond the king's authority and barred the king from observing its terms under threat of excommunication. Quote, Pope Innocent III successfully applied or threatened the interdict 85 times against uncooperative princes. So next slide. With his power with secular rulers now established, Pope Innocent set out to assure his ability to control people's belief. Even excommunication did not work. In 1199, he declared heresy to be treason against God. Treason punishable by death. As one authorities, the rationale for this cruel punishment was familiar and on the whole acceptable to the evil people. Heresy is treason against God, it's more heinous than treason against the king, itself punishable by death. Relying on this rationale, Innocent III became the first pope to apply force on a considerable scale to suppress religious opinions. During his papacy, a group of Christians in northern Italy and southern France called Cathars believed, like the Gnostics and Christians before them, that the material world had been created by an evil God that was not the God of the New Testament. They believed that flesh was evil and all sexual relations were sinful. As a result, they advocated celibacy, banned the eating of meat, milk, and eggs, which they associated with the evils of reproduction. Quote, accepted Christ's Sermon on the Mount as their ethic. They now swore or any use of force, even against infidels. They renounced ownership of property and the swearing of oaths. They rejected the concept of hell, and thought that all men could be saved because they thought was what they saw their own period. Cathars claimed, quote, that they alone were the true Christians leading an apostolic life. In 1209, Innocent III declared that the Cathars were heretics and ordered a crusade against them, promising that crusaders would be relieved from the consequences of any past sins if they joined the crusade. Knights acting on behalf of the Pope attacked the Cathars and, quote, slew 20,000 men, women, and children in indiscriminate massacre. This crusade, known as the Albigensian Crusade, eventually killed between 100,000 and 200,000 people, the Pope called innocents. So that's with the Cathars eliminated in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, under Innocent III's leadership, provided for the state's punishment of heretics, the confiscation of their property, excommunication of those unwilling to move against heretics, and complete forgiveness of sins for those cooperating. Bishops were given the job of finding suspected heretics and presenting them to the church, to secret church courts, which the names of the accusers were not provided, and the accused had the burden of proving his or her innocence. The definition of heresy is extended to include opposition to any papal pronouncement, as well as sacrilege, blasphemy, sorcery, sodomy, and refusal to pay papal taxes. It was made the duty of every Catholic to persecute heretics. Next slide. The Waldensians, the followers of Peter Waldo, were deemed heretics and many were killed. But they continued underground and are the only medieval sect that has survived. Just today.
Wait, they didn't believe in procreation?
No, these are the Waldensians. These
Oh,
are not
okay.
the Catholics.
I was
These are
gonna
the
say, that
followers
doesn't
of
make
Peter
sense.
Waldo. Yeah, the people that do not believe in reproduction go out of business.
Yes.
Like the Shakers.
Picked up that.
Go next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay.
There you go.
In 1852, excuse me, in 1252, Pope Clement IV, another innocent pope, officially sanctioned torture as a way of getting confessions from suspected heretics. His bull stated bodily torture has been found the most salutary and efficient means of leading to spiritual repentance. Quote, as each bout of torture began, the inquisitor intoned, tell the truth for the love of God. Next slide. Under a finding, upon a finding of heresy in these secret trials, the prisoner was turned over to secular authorities for the punishment required of the church, usually burning at the stake. You might want to know why burning was used. Make sure that the condemned heretic could never be resurrected. Next slide.
Good.
By 1250, all of Aristotle's writings have been translated by Muslim scholars and introduced into the Christian West. I think most people know this. Muslims brought Aristotle to the West. Aristotle had taught that the application of logic could lead to truth, because the church taught that the truth depended on the teachings and not on logic. The teachings of Aristotle, quote, precipitated grave crisis for the intellectual leaders of the West. The church initially tried to ban the works of Aristotle, but that proved impossible to enforce. So what followed was a period of, quote, unparalleled intellectual activity in which Christian apologists, called scholastics, justified the traditional teachings of the church by purporting to use Aristotelian logic. So next slide. Thomas Aquinas, I'm sure you've heard his name, was the most important of those medieval scholastics. Actually, there's schools named after him. He was an Italian monk who'd been a professor of theology at the University of Paris. The most important arguments of Thomas support and explain existing church doctrines that became important issues during the Reformation. So let's see a couple of these things. So although the New Testament contains no mention of an intermediate state between heaven and hell, Greek ideas of a place where souls of the dead could be purified before obtaining their final reward had found their way into Christian thought. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great accepted the existence of this intermediate state, but did not give it a name. This place of purging and wise fire, which promised an eternal entrance to heaven, was by the 12th century given a name: purgatory. Purge. To prove the existence of purgatory, Thomas Aquinas referred to the second Maccabees, quote, "Therefore he made atonement for the dead, so that they might be delivered from sin." Second Maccabees was one of the Greek books in the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that were not part of the Hebrew Bible. So let's go to the next slide. So here's how we get to purgatory. So Thomas thought he was using the best Aristotelian logic. The dead in hell are doomed to be there forever, so actions on their behalf are pointless. You can't pray for the people that are in hell because they're pointless. The dead in heaven don't need to be delivered from sin because they're already in heaven. Therefore, there must be some place where support of the living would be helpful that is neither heaven nor hell, and that place must be purgatory. Quote, "The wicked," said Thomas, "pass into hell. The faithful who have wisely used the means of grace pass into heaven. But the mass of mankind, who are Christians in desire and participants in the sacraments of follow Christ inadequately, must suffer further purification in purgatory before attaining the joys of heaven." The whole idea of purgatory, which we'll see is so important to the Reformation, came from Thomas Aquinas. Thomas, let's go, next slide. Thomas also applied his logical analysis to the question of papal authority over secular rulers. Since Jesus had given the keys of heaven to Peter and given him the power to make agreements binding on God, the Pope alone had that power. And secular authorities were there necessarily subordinate to the Pope. As a result, secular authorities had to conform their laws to pronouncements of the Pope, and also obligated to execute people deemed heretics by the Church. Look at the next slide. In 1302, during a dispute with French King Philip IV, Pope Boniface VIII issued a bull entitled Unum Sanctum. Relying on the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, Boniface decreed, quote, "The Pope can be judged by no man, but by God alone. The earthly power can claim independence of the Pope. Insofar as any act has moral implications, it is subject to his judgment." Philip rejected this idea, and had the Pope arrested as he was excommunicating the king. The subsequent Pope, Clement IV, canceled the excommunication, giving the king a victory over papal authority. As a result, Boniface is considered the high water mark of papal claims to supreme jurisdictional authority over civil powers. But the Pope's power of excommunication still cowed most secular rulers. In 309, Clement V moved the headquarters of the church from Rome to Avignon on the Rhine River in what is now France. Subsequent popes built this magnificent palace for themselves in Avignon. Here's one description of Avignon. A great palace was built for a pope and his 500 household staff, with masters of the kitchen, food, drinking stables and chapels, audience halls, libraries, vaulted treasure whose cargo of precious metals and stones was cunningly concealed beneath the flagstones. The banqueting hall supplied by a vast kitchen with an octagonal chimney piece. Not everyone was happy with this. Marsilius was born in Padua, Italy, and trained as a physician. Like Thomas Aquinas, Marsilius studied the works of Aristotle and came to exactly the opposite conclusions. In 1324, he published a book called Defender of the Peace, which Pope Clement VI said was the most heretical book he had ever read. Marsilius took on the basis of papal claim of ultimate authority, which the popes claimed derived from Peter. Marsilius asserted that Peter had actually never been to Rome and was never the bishop of Rome. Probably true. He denied that Peter was given any special authority that popes could inherit, even if they were properly considered successors. Marsilius then stood the church's claim of authority on his head in a way that predated the Declaration of Independence by more than 400 years. He wrote that all authority, both temporal and spiritual, had been invested by God in, quote, the people. He delegated their power to the king, quote, to rule their temporal lives, to the Pope to direct their spiritual lives. Quote, the authority of the state was drawn from the people, with a right to depose an unjust ruler. 14th century. Marsilius saw in the papal power of excommunication and interdict and its claims to plenitude of power, even over temporal things, will follow the church from its original spiritual mission. Under his view, the correct model for the church was a model of Jesus and his disciples, who, quote, renounced all worldly possessions and submitted themselves to reigning political authority. Marsilius claimed that the church had no power to enforce divine laws, because the only sanction for violating those laws was in the afterlife. According to him, the sole duty of the clergy, following the example of Jesus, is, quote, to teach, warn, reprove, therefore guide people to salvation that is wholly otherworldly. Sounds familiar, right? Well, guess what happened? Next slide. Marsilius was excommunicated for heresy in 1327. 1320, Louis of Bavaria captured Rome and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Relying on the teachings of Marsilius that emperors trump popes, Emperor Louis deposed the Avignon Pope and appointed Nicholas V as an anti-pope in Rome, Marsilius as his imperial vicar. Pope John the 22nd soon excommunicated his rival in Rome. For Nicholas, the threat of burning forever in hell overcame Marsilius' idea of religious freedom and promptly submitted to Pope John's authority. Marsilius argued that the Pope's last black power and the people rule had withered under the deadly fire of excommunication. But his writings survived. And scholars today believe they influenced the views of John Locke that eventually found their way to the Declaration of Independence and influenced American views on religious freedom. We'll talk more about that later. 1343, relying on the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, Pope Clement VI announced from Avignon that the treasure of merits that Jesus had left to the church could be drawn on by all church members to forgive their sins while they were alive. His imagery was vivid because Jesus could have saved humanity with a single drop of blood. The rest of the blood he spilled was available to save anyone who needed it. And since this extra merit had been left to the church could sell this power of forgiveness, leading to the sales of indulgences. Popes had the authority to spend the money from the sale of indulgences as they saw fit. They often saw fit to give them themselves or their relatives. Much of the money from the sale of indulgences went into the papal palace, not the All right, another morning star. John Wycliffe was an English priest who gained a reputation as a brilliant scholar at Oxford. In 1366, the English Parliament asked his opinion about whether England had a continuing duty to pay the tribute to the Pope that King John had agreed to. Like Marsilius, Wycliffe argued that the king owed no allegiance to the Pope. And also like Marsilius, Wycliffe found no basis for the grand lifestyle of the popes. In 1370s, soon after the sales of indulgences began, he wrote, quote, if Christ would not have so much as a little house in which to rest his head, how should Christ's vicars be so great a Lord in this world? Because Augustine had taught that only certain people were destined to be saved, Wycliffe thought the church should not be selling indulgences that could not change God's plan. He wrote, quote, "Prelates deceive men by feigned indulgences or pardons and rob them of their money. Men be great fools to buy these bulls." So in 1378, the citizens of Rome rioted. They wanted a Roman pope. They didn't want a pope in France. So under pressure, the cardinals chose a Roman pope who sought to terminate French influence and return the papacy to Rome. 4 months later, the same cardinals decided they made a mistake, elected another pope who returned to Avignon. Both popes excommunicated each other and placed the other countries under interdict, resulting in what is called another great schism. Each pope claimed the loyalty of about half of Europe, as you can see on this map. Wycliffe reacted to this great schism with sarcasm. Quote, "I always knew the Pope had cloven feet, now he's a cloven head." Wycliffe also began a series of writings for rejecting the whole traditional structure of the medieval church. So Wycliffe taught that the Bible and not, but this is still 14th century, taught that the Bible and not the Pope should be authority for the people. His writings inspired the translation of the Bible in English, so understood by average people. This picture shows him reading the newly translated Bible to people who did not read the Latin in the Bible used by the church at the time. Wycliffe could find no basis for the biblical basis for the doctrine of transubstantiation, which held that the communion host literally became the body of Jesus when it was eaten. Based on the teachings of Augustine, Wycliffe taught that the true church consists only of those predestined, the teaching that was later picked up by John Calvin. According to Wycliffe, quote, "A pope who grasps worldly power and is eager for riches is presumably not a elect, is therefore a veritable antichrist." The same words that Luther used to describe it. In 1382, a church council condemned 24 of Wycliffe's propositions as heresy, starting with his denial of transubstantiation. After Wycliffe died in 1384, the church banned the publications or use English translations of the Bible. As one of the rights, quote, "The church had no desire to share the secrets of its trade." Next slide. Wycliffe's followers, disparagingly called the Lollards or the Mumblers. Many were persecuted and killed. One of the most famous was an English knight, Sir John Oldcastle. 1417, he was suspended from a gallows over a fire, enabling him to be hanged for treason and burned for heresy at the same time.
Wow.
The Lollards were effectively extinguished by this execution, but later writers acknowledged their contribution to the Reformation. Wycliffe became known as the Morning Star of the Reformation. Next slide. If you've been to Prague, you know about this statue. John Wycliffe's writings inspired John Hus of Bavaria, the most famous priest in Prague in the early 1400s. Hus, whose name means goose in Czech and whose statue in Prague is shown here, spoke out against priests who shamefully squander pay, requiem masses in fornication, and adorning their concubines, priestesses or prostitutes from the tithes and offerings of the poor. When the Pope sent agents to Prague to sell indulgences to raise money for crusade against the King of Naples, Hus, quote, "preached against the church's collection of money to spill Christian blood and called the Pope a money grower and antichrist." Hus taught that the true life, the life of the true church, is one of Christ-like simplicity and poverty. The only law of his church is the Bible, above all the New Testament. For about 200 years, the Catholic Church had refused to allow Christians to drink the communion wine and articulated the doctrine of concomitance, in which the blood of Christ was in both the communion bread and communion wine. Hus taught that all Christians who receive the wine as well as the bread and the Eucharist, that priests should give up their wealth. The next one. In June 1410, church authorities burned 17 of Wycliffe's writings in Prague, and Pope John the 23rd excommunicated Hus. From 1412 to 1418, a council was held in the German city of Constance, succeeded in unifying the church under one pope, Pope Martin V. That council also tried John Hus, condemned him as a heretic. Huss was burned at the stake on July 6, 1450, the anniversary of which is a national holiday in the Czech Republic. There are many versions of his last words, including this one. As the official executioner was about to light the pyre at the feet of the reformer, he said, "Now we will cook the goose." "Yes," replied Huss, "there will come an eagle in 100 years that you will not reach." Since Luther wrote his famous theses about 100 years later, there's some doubts that some claims that Luther's followers made up this story, but there is no doubt that Huss died soon. Let's go next slide. Ready for that. For this. The Council of Constance also condemned the dead John Wycliffe as a heretic. And since he could no longer be burned at the stake because he was dead, the council ordered his bones be dug up and burned, his ashes thrown in the river. He showed this old woodcut.
We could have done without that. Just saying. How about this one?
Despite the execution of Huss, his followers called Hussites continued advocating for religious reforms. In 1419, a group of Hussites marched to Prague's new town hall, which is here, which had been built southeast of the original city by Charles V, the King of Bohemia. They demanded the release of sympathizers held prisoner by local officials. When someone inside threw a rock, the Hussites stormed the building, tossed the chief magistrate and his council out a tower window, killing 7 council members.
Wow.
This event became famous as the defenestration of Prague. Fenestration meaning the window. Go next slide. In 1458, the Hussites declared independence from the Roman Catholic Church 60 years before Luther. The Moravian Church today is the spiritual descendant of that church and considers itself the first Protestant denomination. In 1999, Pope John Paul II apologized for the execution of Huss, praising his courage in the face of death. Pope Francis spent a special envoy to events in Prague on July 56, 2015, marking the 600th anniversary of Huss's death. During his early days as a monk, Martin Luther was influenced by sermons of Huss that found their way to church. Well, the number of indulgences that the church could sell to forgive the sins of the living was limited by the number of living. So in 1476, Pope Sixtus IV, to find more opportunities, quote, permitted the living to buy and apply indulgence to deceased loved ones, assumed to be suffering in purgatory for unrepentant sins. So we can now sell indulgences not for the living, but for the dead. The church claimed authority to affect the souls of the dead based on the teachings of Thomas Aquinas that the Pope had direct jurisdiction over all souls and exercises episcopal rights in every territory, including heaven. As one of our the door was thus open to the unscrupulous to present as indulgence as a quasi-automatic and easy means of salvation. Next slide. Until Sixtus IV, inquisitions had been under the control of the Pope. On November 1st, 1478, Sixtus IV yielded to pressure from King Ferdinand of Aragon, giving the king the ability to name his own inquisitors and carry his own inquisitions. The initial intent was to detect a sincere conversion to Judaism, from Judaism to Christianity before persecution. And on March the 31st, 1492, after Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada from Muslims, completing the reconquest of Spain, they issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering all Jews to leave Spain within 4 months unless they converted to Christianity. By July 31st, 1492, up to 800,000 Jewish residents had fled Spain to avoid execution without trial. Same in 1492 when Columbus sailed off the America. Slide 42. Well, this represented a significant departure from previous practices. Popes had found heresy only when baptized Christians had fallen away from Christian orthodoxy. Now non-Christians could be killed unless they changed their beliefs or left the country. As one author writes, quote, Western Christianity before 1500 must rank as one of the most intolerant religions in world history. Its record in comparison with medieval Islamic history is embarrassingly poor. In the writings and teachings of Peter Waldo, Silius, Wycliffe, and Huss are all the basic ideas about religious freedom and political freedom that we take for granted today. In those same writings are the basic ideas underlying the Protestant Reformation, including the right of people to read the Bible in the language. Why didn't those ideas catch fire when they were first articulated, as they did when they were later repeated? Many scholars believe the answer is easy. These early reformers all came before the invention of the printing press. As one author noted with respect to Wycliffe's followers, quote, one of the reasons that the Lauters had failed to consolidate widespread support what a century and a half later their evangelical successors did was the fact that they could not produce enough copies of the literature to distribute. At the time of Wycliffe, even a few handwritten pages of the letters of Paul in English were worth a quote, a carload of hay. By the time of Martin Luther and John Calvin, wide dissemination of ideas was not a problem, and both made effective use of the printing press, bringing about the Protestant Reformation in Germany and Switzerland. So next week, we'll talk about that Reformation, including the teachings of John Calvin that underlie the Reformed tradition. As we will see, unfortunately, the Reformation did not by itself resolve the right of individuals to control their religious beliefs. Instead, it largely resulted in a transfer of power to control relief from the Pope to the increasingly powerful secular authorities, which condemned the suppression, continued the suppression of what they deemed to be heretical beliefs. So the story of how we came to be in control of our beliefs comes later, much later. But as we'll see in the last presentation in this series, the debate over who should control religious beliefs continues to this day. Okay. Questions, thoughts, observations? Silence. I don't know if any of you knew how bad the treatment of heretics was under the popes and under Ferdinand and Isabel. Christopher Columbus actually witnessed the fall of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabel, which gave him the right to then go and ask for money to come to the world. Thoughts? Questions?
I once
Jerry?
read a book, forgive me, I cannot remember the name of it, but it was basically a synopsis of all the popes throughout history. And it gave a brief history of each pope and what transpired. And it was a fascinating book, but to underline what you were just saying about heretics and understanding what took place, it was a real eye opener in terms of violence and money and all kinds of debauchery and things that took place that was reflected through that book. So it does not surprise me from that.
Well, one of the things we're going to learn next week, and it's unfortunate, the killing of heretics did not stop under the Protestant reformers. Calvin and Luther were both responsible for killing people that were heretics. It simply got transferred from the Pope to others.
Well, we have some history of it here in this country as well.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about when we go to the finally. The idea that people should be free to believe is very recent in our history. We had the Puritans killing people for their beliefs, killing Quakers for their beliefs. It's not just the popes, not just the people in Germany and Switzerland. It was people here.
Ironic that they fled England for that freedom.
Freedom to kill heretics.
To be able to choose
Freedom
which
to kill
heretics.
Choose which heretics to kill. Yes.
That's a great freedom.
They did not come for religious freedom. They came for the freedom to do what they wanted to do, even if that meant killing others.